Well, everyone, thanks for stopping by and tuning into another episode of the Announcers Hour podcast. I'm your host, Patrick McCall, and today we have a special guest on, Luke Williams, and he's done a ton of broadcast work already in the esports scene, which is something we haven't had like a perspective on, and so that is going to be great to get into. And so, Luke, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. You know, what better way to start off the week? I just started school today than to meet here and talk on some broadcasting. So, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. And by the way, are you at Ohio State now, right?
Yep, Ohio State.
Awesome. And so, what made you want to go there?
So, two partial things. When I played, so I actually played esports at Ohio Northern University, and my team got cut because the president didn't believe in it. So it was a little bit more expensive to go there. And my mom also works for Ohio State, so like it's cheaper, it's closer to home, kind of all that.
Yeah, I know. Well, Ohio State is interesting because it has like a big sports broadcast thing, and so now you'll be expanding kind of almost your responsibility in the broadcast work to that. As I saw recently, like what sports are you excited to get into there?
Oh, honestly, all of them. Like I think like my favorite sports, like football, hockey, are like my top two. But like I love to do anything, and I think specifically like everybody knows like Ohio State football here in Ohio. Like of course it's like the biggest thing, but like I always loved in like esports like getting to cast like smaller communities or like smaller games. So like even doing like a smaller sport that maybe others don't know about would be really cool too.
Yeah, there's a lot we can dive into in a little bit on that, but staying to the current, what kind of what are the titles that different titles that you have now is in the broadcasting scene on the esports side, and what are you kind of responsible for there?
Yeah, so right now I kind of again esports is a little bit less structured to get a kind of idea. There's a lot of like one-time pop-up events that they'll have a random tournament for a random game title, but the main ones I do right now are Apex Legends and Rocket League. So I played Apex, it was where I kind of came from, and at the moment my two more like consistent gigs that happen every single week are a Monday and a Wednesday Rocket League tournament. So they happen every single weeknight and they have like the top rank of the game and they come in and play for some money.
And so with esports, I know it's all there's plenty of games and stuff, and just to familiarize me and everyone else out there, like so for a play, but for going into sports, you're gonna have a play-by-play and a color guy, but is it different where in esports both guys have like played the game to a high level and then you're on the mic?
It really depends. For esports, it honestly depends on the game title. Like I take Rocket League for example. It's a very fast-paced game, and it's something where like there isn't really even a play-by-play or a color. Kind of both commentators are doing a hybrid the entire time because a goal could happen literally every 30 seconds or every 10 seconds. So you have to be ready for it. And the interesting thing, everybody always comes to me and they're like, "Oh, Luke, you're good at casting or whatever. Do you play these games?" And I'm like, not really. I don't have time to play every single one of them. So I have the kind of player perspective from playing Apex, but most casters aren't necessarily the highest level or came from playing in the highest level in the game.
Yeah, that makes some sense and everything. And so, like, for those events as well, like, how do those get structured too? Because I know sports, like, a lot of there's a league and a season and stuff like that. I don't think it's as obvious in esports. Like, how do those events come together, and what's kind of the industry behind that?
Yeah, so usually kind of just like sports, it has different like tiers. So you have you're like tier one, two, three, and in tier one, it's mostly leagues. So you have like 10 teams that'll play on a weekly basis, and then they'll have like a regional championship every 3 months, and then maybe a world championship every 6 months. But when you get lower and lower, it kind of gets more chaotic. So there are some like tier three leagues that have like lower skill players or players trying to climb the ladder. But what's interesting about the two like Monday and Wednesday events I do is like it's anybody can join. So like it could be like random teams, collegiate teams. It could be like maybe the team broke up overnight. That's one of the crazy things too, is like there's like roster changes all the time. So it really depends on where you look.
That's interesting. And are you familiar at all too, like with, how many sort of the hours that go behind getting to a professional level and like how much, because I know like on the physical side in athletics, there's seems to be only so much, but it does seem easier, even though it's a grind, like to be on the computer, you won't get physically as tired. So like how many hours are guys like sacrificing to be great at a game?
It's it's honestly I want to say ballpark like 2000 hours on air has got to be like the rough estimation, but it is a little bit tougher depending on like what game title you're familiar with in esports. Like there are some that don't have like any lower casting gigs. So like all the really good ones are gonna not only be on the tier one stuff, but they're taking pretty much everything else, and there's no real room to move. So a lot of people are just doing like volunteer gigs and doing it as like a side thing. But I think around 2,000 hours, and that's the nice thing about Rocket League. My main game is there's a lot of room to move. There's a lot of like third party events.
That's cool. And by the way, one of the things that I always thought looking into it from my perspective, like on esports, it's got to be really hard to, well, either be one playing and then two, like broadcasting it because you got to know a lot of games because they literally change. And so, how do you keep up with that? Because I'm sure there's some staples like Counter-Strike or something that's been around forever and probably not going away. But then there's like a new game that comes out, you got to know it and then cast it where the money's at. So how do you like change with all that? Where sports, you know what games you're going to be getting.
Yeah, it's kind of just I love preparation. I love to be very very prepared to make sure I'm ready to go. So if a new game comes out, I'll usually play some of it and then watch professionals play it and kind of there's always patch notes that release every time there's an update. So try to keep myself a little bit familiar with those, but it can be kind of chaotic where like just random things come out where like you said like football is not changing its major rules every 6 months, so it's kind of interesting, and it changes up play styles, it changes up teams based on how things change in the game as well.
And like, do you how much storytelling kind of goes into it? I know one of the things that we've talked about on the broadcasting is a lot of the aspect of storytelling, like in
Yeah.
when you're getting into elite level play by play and really on any media. So like, how do you integrate that at all into an esports broadcast, and how do you do that and get to know the guys that are playing the games?
I try to. I think that's one of the most important things is like in sports you see their real name, you see a real person, and like esports is just like random guy 1 2 3 where you don't know who it is, you don't know the player behind it. So the one league I really love casting, I get to do this high school esports league that's in Pennsylvania. And like we get to interview the players and get to see like the behind the scenes. And they might not be like the greatest number one player in the world, but it's like it's cool to learn their stories. And then like you can kind of intertwine that in towards broadcast. So I love to do the storytelling, but like I said, it is sometimes hard when you're having like four random teams you've never met before playing off against each other.
Yeah, and by the way, like how do you are you familiar with how the esports teams come together? And secondly, how many games will like let's say there's a team and they go to event to event, like
Yeah.
will they play multiple games or is it just they're trying to really hash it out on one?
So usually they only have one. Like you usually pick that's your main game and you're sticking to it. But it depends. Like for most players, it's like there's a lot of in-game rank systems that you can just put as many hours as you want into it and try to climb the ranks, try and get to a higher rank yourself. But also it's kind of interesting. Like some esports specifically, like League of Legends has a really good like pipeline through collegiate up towards pro and like has that good tiered system, but some are kind of just like the Wild West where like Rocket League has one of the youngest average ages of players. There's like 15-year-olds competing in the world championships. So like you never know. It could just be like a player that puts in 2,000 hours at home, gets really good, and then a team notices them and gets them.
So what would you do you have any like advice for anybody that's looking to get, either into esports and maybe as a player as well? I don't know how many events you've played in that position, but also on the broadcasting side, and how would they do it like and first get into that?
Yeah, so on the broadcasting side, it's kind of just grab whatever you can grab. I think that it should be more it's not something you want to force. Like if you're like me and you enjoy every game, sure do it, but if you only enjoy one game, like don't force yourself to learn all these other ones and stuff. And I originally started just doing a passion project with a place that ran scrimmages for an Apex League. So I got to cast those, I got to host all the matches. That was super cool to me, but it has to be like your passion, I think, to follow it. And then like once you do that, there's a couple Discord servers. There's one called Broadcast GG that has like 15,000 members and it's all full of broadcast talent, and people just post like, here's a volunteer gig, here's a couple paid gigs, here's whatever, and then like you can send your resume off to them and apply. Now, if you are a player, it's a little bit different. I think that going through the actual game is the best way because a lot of them have really, really good rank structure. But I have always said like it's it's even less likely that you become a professional player at the esports level than like a sports level. So like my big thing and like what my parent I totally agreed with my parents. My parents are like, you need a backfall, like you need a safety net or something. So even when I was playing, I was pursuing a degree as well.
Yeah, no, I know it gets really tough, and I've seen, I mean, even games like that I used to play just get people were just the player base is better and better over time, and it can get crazy. And so, like in esports and in broadcasting that, going off that point, and the broadcasting style I always thought was different, like, or from what I could pick up, but how much different is it like on an esports call? Do you have to continuously be more excited, whereas play-by-play is a little more up and down? And how much like casual conversation are you allowed to have, or do you have to keep up with exactly what's happening?
It usually depends on the game again, but if you take like a Rocket League game, you imagine like a whole game of soccer smashed into like 5 minutes. So you have to kind of keep on your toes, and then you have casual conversations in between the games. You kind of get to break it down where there's like seven soccer games, if you can imagine, like smashed into a 35-minute period. But if you look at something like you were talking about, like Counter-Strike, there's a lot of like patience and silence that they use specifically in their casting because there's a lot of dead moments where in Rocket League it's not really that. So it really depends, and it's kind of interesting. Like that's why I like casting so many different titles is I get to learn like, oh, there's a different style for each different game, and I can kind of bring them together to make my own style.
Yeah, and I think another thing like too, is there any game that is, like the most challenging you think to broadcast? And so like I don't know what would it be like. I trying to think, but I feel like one that might be like sneakily difficult is maybe like PUBG or something where it's kind of like in baseball when you're doing play by play, like nothing's happening for a while and then all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden a lot is happening. So, what are the most difficult esports you think to broadcast?
Yeah, I think battle royales, like you were talking about, PUBG, Apex, I think are really tough because, like you said, it's very unlinear in the action where anything can happen at any moment. You have to be ready to go. I also think MOBAs, especially like League of Legends, that have a lot of names that you have to learn, like item names. There are like 200 playable characters in League of Legends, and you got to learn like all four of each of their ability names. So it can be a lot of information at the start, but like once you kind of learn that, that's what I think about like the battle royales and like League of Legends. It can make them a more interesting esport because they have like so many complications to them. If you understand all that, yeah, it's a lot of like base entry level. It can make it more interesting, and you can tell a more interesting story for the viewer.
Yeah, that's great. And do you know how much like transition there is between a specific player into other esports? Because I thought that was one thing I did notice, like some guys can be great at a game, like maybe they have a good translatable skill, like their aim or something, they can be relevant for the next game. So like how much of that is there, and is there just these guys that are kind of like esports celebrities that are going to be good at pretty much each game?
Yeah, I think there's kind of both. I think that specifically aim, I think is the biggest thing, but also like mentality and mindset is a tough thing to build in esports too. Like there's no physical limitations. You could play for 16 hours a day. You're going to be exhausted, but you're not really going to be like physically exhausted. There's not a stop that's going to take you out of it. So it's something where you kind of see the split between like casual players and pro players of like they invest so much more time, they invest all of their resources, and like if you switch to a different game, like there are going to be some things that transfer over, but I think like the mentality is the biggest thing. Like just putting in that many hours, being on a consistent schedule is crazy.
And I think that's another thing that's cool because I know like there's maybe a few guys, especially at a pro level, that actually transition in terms of like,
Yeah.
like maybe like Deion Sanders, for example, can play baseball and football,
Mm-hmm.
and that's like one in a billion kind of thing. So it's really rare. But, you know, um, when you're kind of going to an esports event, diving into the prep process, something we talked about a lot on this podcast, like It's really cool to see different guys and their play-by-play charts and everything, but it's not the same, I'm sure, for esports. So, what's the prep process like? And I know you sent me some notes, but how does that break down for you?
Yeah, usually I try to get as much information on the teams and their past as possible. I think just trying to tell the best story is the goal of any broadcaster, but it is sometimes really tough when, like, again, we're talking about some players are behind that gamer tag. Some players, like, if you're talking about like JV or something of some of the leagues I cast, they don't even have information out there. Like, they're just playing to have fun or whatever. So you don't have as much information. You have to kind of build that story on your own. And then you talk about the events where, like, you don't know who's playing, and it's like you can kind of build a story from the past if you called games before, but maybe it's your first time there. So sometimes I don't even do prep sheets if it's just going to be like a random one-off tournament.
Yeah, I can imagine it's not as easy to pull like as an esports story to a sports story. And in saying that too, like on the statistical side, that's another whole thing, and I don't know how that's tracked, and it has to change, I'm sure, esport to esport, game to game. But like, are there any analytical data points that you can actually look at for a player, and how relevant is that for predicting their performance?
Yeah, it depends game to game again, but they're like for Valorant and CSGO, like the first person shooters, there's a lot of like online information about like what characters they play, what maps they're good on, and stuff like that. But for other games, it's kind of just like, they're this rank, they're this good amongst everybody else in the world, and you have to kind of build the story based on how they play in the game. But I honestly, there are a lot of good tools for esports building right now, so it's always fun to see like the new stat tracker tool come out or something, because it always helps me, even though it's helping the players in the game.
Yeah, and like, do you know any like a ranking system that seems to be the best over others, or are there ways to intricately track what guys are doing in the game?
Yeah, I mean, I I honestly think they're all kind of similar. Like, it's kind of a base rank system from like bronze up to diamond, and then a lot of games use where like they have like a master rank or grandmaster or something, and then they'll have something where it's like the top 500 of that rank. So like whoever you can be in that rank, but you can also be like better. You can be top 500 or whatever in the world too.
Yeah, and it's really I feel like it's less subjective almost sometimes than sports, like where you actually do have to win like the games and
Mm-hmm.
perform, whereas like, sometimes in an AP top 25 you can get selected up there probably when you shouldn't be, just on bias. But it's always interesting to see. And like moving forward, and what would you think you would like to do in the esports scene, and how much of it would you want to balance with sports, or like how much do you see yourself getting into sports with that?
I mean, the life goal, the big ambitious goal would to be like be on a tier one broadcast, be able to pay for like all of my living and expenses just through that esports broadcast. But it'd be really cool to do sports too. And like I said, I'm not really super favorite at either one. It's just I have more esports work right now. So I think the goal is always just get more stuff. And as long as I'm enjoying it, which I currently have been for 4 years, I mean, why stop?
That's a good message. And how much do you think esports can grow? And then secondly, I feel like maybe one of the issues for it was the barrier to entry, or maybe people aren't as familiar
Yeah.
with a lot of these games like League of Legends and Dota or stuff like that, which
Mm-hmm.
are all competitive, but it's like you got to really know so much to get into it. So how do you think like those can be knocked down? And secondly, how much do you think this can grow?
I mean, I think it has a lot of height ceiling, but I do think it has its limit. Like you were kind of mentioning, like League of Legends is my personal favorite game to watch, but like I know when we put it on in my living room, like my parents are like, "Wait, what's that? What's going on there?" And like again, it's the knowledge to entry barrier. You take something like Rocket League, which I'm surprised it hasn't gone like super global, super big just yet, but I think it's a little bit easier to understand. So I think the games that are a little bit easier to understand will gain more in like regular people popularity and kind of grow towards its big size. But the other problem is like esports games are dying too. Like as we create new ones, like the old ones are falling off as well. And that's tough. Like if you're following a football team, in 20 years they're not going to be gone. Like they're still going to be there. So it's really tough to kind of build those audiences if you're losing them.
Yeah, and that's kind of a something I imagined as well. And so in saying that, I wanted to ask, like, do you think the way for it to grow would be people have to get more attached to a team and a player rather than, a game?
I think so. I have a lot of Cloud9 stuff as my favorite esports team, and I kind of follow all their different stuff. I think following a team specifically is pretty good, but then again, it's also saying that esports has been like super volatile, especially in the past like 3 4 years. We've seen just like esports teams just dissolve out of like thin air that have had like multiple teams and multiple different games. So it's kind of wild. It's kind of crazy. I don't know.
Yeah, it really switches up. And, you know, going back to you as well, like how many games did you play growing up in video games? Did you always like that? As much as sports, or what was kind of the go-to for you?
Yeah, I mean, I never did any. Okay, I technically did contact sports, but I did taekwondo and running were my two things. And kind of, yes, taekwondo, we did sparring against each other, but running was kind of like a more battle against myself type deal. I didn't love like physical sports. And like from my young age, like my dad was always a gamer. So like I was always game with him. And I'm like, you know what? This is super cool. And I definitely enjoyed games growing up as well.
Right. And by the way, like, you know, going to the actual event side, how many of
Yeah.
the events that get put together, like when you broadcast, how many are you in person? How many are you remote? Because those are, on the play-by-play side, two very different broadcasts when you do them. So how much like are you in person and remote?
I would say it's less than like 5% that I've done in person broadcasts because a lot of it is just like I work a lot actually with a guy that lives in the UK that does like American time events, and it's kind of crazy. That's what esport does. It's a nice thing that you can bring everybody together, but it's also harder to do in person events, and that's mostly only seen at like the top level, or like though there are some local events. I've done some here in Columbus where we have like a gaming cafe and they run some tournaments out of there. So I've done some through them, but I'd say less than 5%. I've only done like 10 or 15 in person events.
Yeah, that is interesting. And do you think like that makes it more difficult to broadcast when you're remote, even though that's most of the time like more
Yeah.
difficult than in person?
Yeah. I mean, I think the remote is kind of interesting because like the in person, it's a lot of setup because there's not usually just like 20 PCs laying around in a room. So you got to like set all that up. You have to set up a stadium for people to watch. You have to, set up the whole caster stuff with all the mics and all the lights and everything. So I honestly think like the remote ones are kind of more fun because you don't have all that setup and teardown.
Right. And I think another one of the other big things that I wanted to ask, like, how does the equipment for an esports event kind of work? Because,
Yeah.
well, number one, it's got to be expensive. Secondly, I think of like all the other games, everything's kind of monitored on the sports side, and
Mhm.
everybody you feel like it's an even playing level. But then, like, if you get good at a game, you're using your
Yeah.
own settings and own setup, then how do they translate that for showing up in an event to make sure they're still on the same thing, or do they have to adjust?
Yeah, so usually at an event they'll have like base gear just in case you didn't bring their own, but it's kind of like you mentioned, most players will bring like their own controller, their own like old dusty keyboard to the event that they really trusted. But I think it's kind of interesting because like you said, like you have that like discrepancy of like you take like a regular player could be playing on something and then like a professional player is going to have this like enhanced gear, and there's arguments about like how much it actually helps, how much it does give you, but it's kind of interesting to see those differences.
I mean, it does add something. I know in sports, it's kind of like really like that in a way, I guess, at
Yeah.
all times. Like, I know if you're playing on the Rockies, for example, and you get to play their 82 games, you'll get the benefit of course field and the carry there. But then, if you're on another team, you don't get that. So it's like those are
Yeah.
kind of adjusted, and I guess that just comes with the nature of it. But by the way, are there any like esports broadcasters that are really, famous that, sports people might not be as familiar with? What do they do well, and have you gotten to know them?
So I have two favorite esports broadcasters. One goes by the name of Fallout, and the other is Zephyr. So both of them work on the Apex Legends Tier 1 Pro League. Fallout, I think Fallout was one of the original people selected. He's been working in broadcast for like 10 years at this point. And I think the interesting thing about him is he does other stuff like he made it to the top level of broadcasting and then now works at like Microsoft. So he does it kind of like it's not even like a side job, but like his gaming career brought him to casting and then it brought him to like being able to work at Microsoft and he still does casting even at the highest level. So I think that's pretty cool. And then Zephyr, who is his actual name is Benjamin Fawcett, he does meteorology work at Texas A&M, but he was one of like the original people when I was starting out that I got to actually cast with. And he kind of mentored me. He said, here's some steps towards going towards the next level. Here's what I did or whatever. And then a year later, he got signed to the tier 1 broadcast as well. So it's been super cool to like see him rise in the ranks.
That is awesome. And, I'm wondering too, because everybody on the play-by-play side and the broadcasting and media, like one of the toughest things is to get that full-time kind of gig. And so on the esports scene, like, does that even exist as far as full-time broadcasting? Does a team hire a broadcaster, or, how does that all break down? And is that a thing that would be possible?
Yeah, it definitely is. It is a little bit tougher because, as the saying goes, it's always been in esports filling roles through dead man's shoes. So it has to be maybe there's somebody else leaving or them getting cut from the top. Because if an esports has been there for 4 years or 5 years, they aren't really going to be changing around their production talent. But it does exist, especially in like in League of Legends. They have a local studio in LA that they broadcast all of the weekly games at. All of the casters like have to live in LA because they do all the casting live. And of course, like that job does pay well enough for it. And some of the other casters at the other top for the other games, it is good enough, but like I said, the spots are very limited.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I'm thinking as well, like sticking to the player side, I mean, how much do you ever get to like interview a player after a game or before a game, and like how much do you learn on that side? And are you asking kind of questions that are really intricate to the game, or is it more about their personality?
It honestly depends. I have done a couple of interviews or a decent amount of interviews depending on which league it is. For some of the weekly stuff, we don't interview players after just because it's like 1 in the morning and the players want to get to sleep or whatever. But it depends on the person too. Like a lot of sports players are like media trained or understand how to talk to cameras, and some esports players just don't. So sometimes you have to like lob them some questions about ask them about food or asking about like their day or whatever. But like if you get specific people like the in-game leader or something, you can ask them about their strategies and stuff. And then it also gets interesting because like they're like, oh no, I can't reveal the strategies because we've got a playoff game tomorrow and the other team could be watching our interview.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point because, as you mentioned, it's almost harder to get when you're not getting interviewed, media trained in esports, and you're sitting oftentimes on a computer and not like in front of a lot of people. So, I mean, do guys ever like get nervous at an event when they're more in front of people? And have you seen that have a real impact on performance?
Oh yeah, I've seen it before, and I mean, I'll say without shame, I get nervous too in front of those crowds when I'm working so many events just from home, and you're like, someone comes up to you and they're like, "Oh, I'm this, that, or the other gamer tag." I'm like, "That's you! I've been watching you the whole season," and you're like, you don't even know who like half the people are. So it's kind of cool, scary at the same time. But I definitely have seen like, especially at like the big world championships where like the crowd is one sided for one team, you can see the nerves hit them.
I bet. And is there any like place you think that right now, I would say country in the world that has more of that esports edge, which has the
Ooh.
biggest programs and teams and stuff?
Well, that one's honestly pretty tough because everywhere, interestingly enough, like sports, kind of has their thing that they're good at, if that makes sense. Like North America's like fourth or fifth in the world scale in like League of Legends, but they're like one or two in Rocket League. So it's kind of interesting. It like very much depends on the game.
I bet. And by the way, what do you think are the top like? Because I know, let's say on American side, they
Yeah.
said the big four is like football, basketball, hockey, and baseball. But what would it be like the top, 4 or 5 esports right now and
Yeah.
games that are being broadcasted?
It's definitely Rocket League right now. North America's the world champions, so we have that to hold over everybody. Valorant we're pretty good at. League of Legends, we're not. We don't usually beat China or Korea because they have a larger population. It's a lot more enjoyed game over there. But it's one of my personal favorites. Even though we don't usually perform well on the world stage, we like it's fun to watch like all the local stuff and then see them go up to there.
Yeah, and do you think there's any like game developers that have been consistent at putting out like games that are competed at, like maybe Valve with Counter-Strike and stuff, or is anyone that sticks out?
Yeah, Riot is definitely the top of my list. I mean, they made Valorant and League of Legends too, like absolutely top of the tier esports scenes, and then they're also actually working on a fighting game called 2XKO, I think. So, and they've been like not only pumping out good games, but also like building in towards their esports scene. And that's the nice thing, like with the Riot games, they have a nice structure. Like I talked about with League of Legends, like Valorant has a really good like go through collegiate, go up to the pros. There's a pipeline to, if you just want to get you and 4 of your friends, you can play all the way through the challenger circuit and make it to the pro league.
Wow, and is there like also too an esport that is you think has the toughest like and most amount of hours that needs to be put in to get great at it, like that out of all of them?
I I think I go back to League of Legends. Like I was saying, it's just it's a lot to learn that like you can play one champion, you could build one set of items for the entirety of your career, but then like the interesting thing about League of Legends, unlike other esports and MOBAs, is you get bans. So you can take away specific played champions from the opposing team. And if it's something they're super good at, if they only practice one thing, well, you could take it off the table before the match even starts.
That's crazy. I so you can like you can literally just take something away from someone else like that.
Yep.
That is awesome. Well, and also too, like, how big is Dota, and is that another game that's still being played competitively, like compared to League of Legends, and how much do those two compare?
Yeah, it's definitely being played competitively. They still have lots of world tournaments. I think it's declining a little bit in popularity, but it's still up there with League of Legends and competes. Yeah.
Right, and do you know, like, have you ever done one thing I feel like maybe would be a little easier to get into if you're a sports guy and you want to do esports broadcasting is actually broadcasting like a Madden tournament or
Yeah.
something like that. And so have you done any of those at all? And how do you think those have run down?
Oh, yeah. I've done some Madden. I've done some FIFA too. I think those are really fun. And like you mentioned, I think they're one of the easier entry to access games, not only for people to watch, for casters to kind of get on the mic for. It's kind of a fun time to do those because, it's like I don't know, you get like crazy outcomes that you would never get in sports, but also it is like a sports game as well.
And what made you um excited to get into sports now with Ohio State, by the way, and just getting back to that because I know that's going to be in your future. And like, have you reached out to anyone to try and start kind of preparing for what that Ryan could be like for you?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been talking with all the other guys in the sports radio. We've been kind of sharing around, of course, what they use for like their preparation work for each game and stuff, and just kind of trying to get as much reps as possible. I think that radio is an entirely different beast from esports casting, and so is TV as well. So I think it's interesting. It kind of goes. I did some back at Ohio Northern, but I think it just makes me excited to learn more, to do more, and to meet more people.
Yeah, is there is it like, do you get number one, nervous at all? Like if you're going to go on the air, and then secondly, is it harder to go on the air in front of an audience in an esports event, or like you think doing whatever games you were able to do at Ohio Northern or predict, what it could be like at Ohio State?
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State, I feel like is gonna make me the most nervous because I feel like it has the possibility of like it's Ohio State esports. Like there could be a lot of people listening. There could be like people that have connections listening, and like, what if I mess up? What if I don't do good on a broadcast or whatever? Could it take me down? But it it feels I to answer your first question, I do get pretty nervous when it comes to like any sort of broadcast, but everybody says I don't show it. I always have like a routine to like lock myself in, get ready, get going. So I'm really excited about the Ohio State stuff, but it also is going to be nerve-wracking getting these first couple under my belt.
I bet. And by the way, like with the actual breakdown of the booth, I think I talked about like having a play-by-play and a color guy earlier, but have you ever done an esports cast solo, and is that even, possible to manage all that?
Yes, I so at the beginning when I was starting out, I produced the stream, I observed the game, and I casted solo. So it was a lot of work, but it is possible, but it's mostly if you're doing a professional broadcast, you usually split up the responsibilities to make it better, sound it better, not make the caster work for like 6 hours talking all by themselves and pull out their voice. So I think if you go up in the higher levels, it's probably nowhere. But there are things called I forget what they call them, co-streams, where like a professional player or like a really popular streamer will like watch the world championship and like give their input and stuff. So they're not really like casting per se, but they'll like give feedback, I guess.
Yeah, and I was wondering too, like, it brings me in another interesting question. Do you guys have like ever a pregame and postgame kind of show, and like how does that all break down behind the scenes? I know we talked about like with Rich Hallenberg in terms of on a television play-by-play, you're going to have a director, and then same with radio, you have probably a producer back in the studio. So like, how many people are you working with when you go on the mic, and do you have people in your ear telling you we need to do this at this time?
So it depends from show to show. And honestly, I've worked with some good producers, I've worked with some bad ones, but the guy I work with on Monday and Wednesdays, it's just him, me, and another caster. So three of us total in the booth. And he gives us like cues to when we're going where. So like he always tells us, I always love it, and he always loves it because the most important thing I think is telling a caster when their face cam is showing to the audience, so you're not like picking your nose or like falling asleep or something like that. So he gives us cues when we're going in game, when our cams are up, but he mostly lets us control the flow ourselves, and like he'll wait for like us to say we're going to check out the prize pool, and then he'll pull up the prize pool that he has pulled up, and like he kind of waits for whoever's the host to actually guide the show.
That makes a lot of sense. And is there anybody that has to like, operate a board at all? And do you guys ever have to take any commercial breaks, or are you just ripping like the whole way through?
So we usually do breaks every 30 to 40 minutes is about what it is. So we for the Rocket League ones, we'll run a full series and then we'll take a little bit of a break. Like they'll have ads, they'll have replays of what happened in the last match, and then we'll come back, do the next match, and then do the same thing. And usually it's just because it's not necessarily like for the commercials, it's just like to give the casters a second to like go to the bathroom, get a drink, whatever.
Makes sense. And by the way, like I know and it's I'm sure another thing that's going to vary sport to esport and game to game, but like how does that break down? I know like in terms of the breaks, like how long does it usually last to get to the next break and action? Because like when you're doing a baseball game, there's always that minute and a half between innings, and like that could be in
Mhm.
like 2 minutes or like 10, but it's coming. Same with basketball, to have like under
Yeah.
that media timeouts like between each like pretty much 4 minutes. So how does that, break down for the games, or is it usually just kind of a big sprint between a break and the action?
Yeah, so at the top levels, they're pretty strict. They're like, we have a 5 minute break. You've got 5 minutes to do whatever, but you have to be back by that time. At kind of the lower levels and some of the weekly events I do, it's kind of more just like if a caster's in the bathroom, they're not going to start back the show. If like we're waiting on a player, it could be like an extra 3 or 4 minutes of like a player's like PC breaks or like the server isn't good enough or something. So it's always kind of interesting. It can definitely vary, and sometimes like you have like a really large viewer audience and you don't want them to sit in the commercial break, and you're like, okay, let's go, 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 everybody go to the bathroom and get back in like a minute to try and keep all the viewers.
And I like that you mentioned, the PC part of it, because I mean you are relying on quite a bit of technology. I guess you could say a little bit of the same in sports, but there's also a lot that could happen. Like you could just continue the game. So, I mean, how does that do you have any like funny stories of something like going wrong and just having to adapt, or like the internet goes out or whatever it is? Like how do you guys overcome that?
I mean, it's kind of just like you said, the show must go on type deal. So oftentimes, like I've had somebody I'm working with, like their PC will crash, and I'm just like, oh, they disappeared from the call. I guess it's my time to solo cast here for like 3 minutes until they get back, or you know, it is what it is. Or maybe like sometimes the producer has an issue where he's like, I need a minute of time, just talk about whatever for a minute and keep extending until we're ready to go. So things definitely always happen. I think the funniest story I've ever had is it's not really funny per se, but I was working with a guy on a Rocket League broadcast, and it was in like the middle of the game, and the guy just says, "I'm getting up to go feed my turtle." I'm like, okay, I guess I'm casting here by myself for 3 minutes, and yeah, he didn't come back. So
Well, I don't know if I've heard like bathroom breaks in the booth and stuff, but that would be a feeding the turtle is not one I've heard yet. But that is a crazy happenstance. And by the way, like, I know there's pretty serious money on the line once you get to those high levels, especially. So, has there been any circumstances where a guy like has their equipment break and then like does that impact the final result or disqualify anybody? And how does that kind of break down?
So it is like at the like top level, they'll actually have like two referees standing like behind the teams. And if like something breaks, they can raise their hand and like immediately pause the match right there. And usually they have like backup equipment, stuff like that. There has been instances where like the referees caught somebody like cheating or hacking in the game and they're like, yeah, your team's disqualified. You can't play like that. So which it happens more like online rather in person because it's a lot easier to cheat without a ref standing right behind you, right? So
Yeah, I know those are always interesting, and I know there's not, going to be too many PEDs, but I've heard like Adderall can be banned at some events. So how does that whole break down? Because that'll heighten your attention span, and I know that's very important.
yeah, I mean it's the one big problem is it's kind of like the Wild West where there's no like NCAA saying here are the restrictions for everything. Usually it's like the game company is like, we don't want our players having XYZ. And then like the big thing is it's usually like the organizations that'll put like their foot down that usually they don't do like drug testing or anything at the venue, but like some of the professional teams, especially like Cloud9 League of Legends, I like to always mention, they have a actually like Monday to Friday full day schedule. So they have like they wake up, they do a fitness routine, they have a chef that cooks them a specific meal, they play video games, but they scrim for 8 hours in a day, and then they do that for 5 days straight. And the coach is also monitoring like, are you taking drugs? Are you off your game? Are you things like this?
Yeah, and by the way, like how much does the something there's always in sports people are like, well, this team's coming off 6 games in 6 days and they're tired and they're coming into a bad spot here and this is like a long road trip and they're going to be not performing their best like on the esports side, what kind of happens to get somebody more tired and like how does that all break down to where they get into a bad situation where like do they just have to play a ton of the game or like they didn't get good sleep because it's like milliseconds. I know
Yeah.
that separates wins and losses there.
Yeah, 100%. I think you look at a game like Valorant and like the World Championships, a lot of the series is they could be like an hour and a half long, or they could be like 3.5 hours. And if you're a team that like played three and a half hour games in a session of like 3 days plus scrims on the side of that, and you're playing like a team that only played 3 hours total, it can definitely be really tough and taxing. And that's why there is like a lot of like burnout and like issues at the top level that it's always like you have to again, video games has no real physical limit, that you have to know your own limit, and sometimes for like the players playing at the highest level they can't have that limit.
Oh yeah, and because I just know I can imagine like maybe it is so split second. Like sometimes in sports, like guys are just,
Yeah.
better than one team straight out, and it still comes down to it. But especially at that level, they're just like just so close. The gaps are so close. But in saying that, like, are there any getting back into the team side?
Yeah.
How does that all do those relationships break down, and how do guys kind of come together as a team? Is it kind of like a sports team where they really know each other over time and then decide to take it to the next level professionally, or is it just kind of a group of guys that, come together because they were the best at what they were doing?
I would say it's about like 10% they all know each other and 90% like it's random-ish. Like there are some teams that, like I said, there's a lot of open like routes that you can take. Like I said, you can get four of your best friends and try and go through the Valorant scene. Is it going to work if you have a day job and all this other thing when the other players are putting in 14 hours a day? Probably not, but it also they'll like pick and choose different players. So like if there's a really good standout player that's playing in like the challenger leagues to get up towards the main level, they'll like take them, they'll try them on the team or something. But like that's the other thing too is like a lot of teams like split up very often. There's roster changes like every season, every 6 months, every 3 months, and that can make it also hard to follow for like the viewers at home.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's another thing that will change game to game, but like how much does the teamwork come into it and how much is this like is esports individualized? Do you think it's important at a lot of games for there to be that teamwork? And I guess maybe compared to sports, like how much do you actually really need to be working with your other teammates?
I think it's almost kind of exactly like sports. Like you can have like a standout player, you could have a wide receiver that's taller, faster than everybody, but if your quarterback sucks, like you're not going to win any games, right? So one of the biggest things I actually got to do some esports coaching this past year was like communication is the most important thing. Like if you can always get your game skill better, you can always improve your aim and other things, but if you're going to be like toxic or anything, it's just going to break up the team environment, and we've seen that at the highest level too. That like again, these are 20-year-old players usually that some of them just straight out of college don't know really how to talk to one another. They've been playing Valorant or something for like 8 years to try and get towards this point, and it can break apart teams. So I think that teamwork is honestly number one priority.
That's I always think that's one interesting because I mean I'm sure there's maybe some esports that are like, golf where it's really on you, but there is also the team element for a lot of it when it's 6v6 and stuff. But, do you think, moving forward for you, you would try to get back into any esports as a player? And if so, are there any games that are catching your eye for that?
I I will say I loved playing esports. I think my time there was amazing and I absolutely enjoyed it, but it's kind of like I don't know, it's a thing in esports like once you hit 20, you're too old to play. It's kind of like a joke, but like seriously, like all the players are super young going into the professional leagues, but I think I wouldn't have like the time anymore to be able to invest to be a pro player with all like the broadcasting and school and stuff I'm doing. It's tough to keep up with like 7 or 8 hours a day of playing and practicing, and even then it's like even if you put in that, you have to be like being in scrims and trying to find teams and finding tournaments. So as much as I loved it, my 2 years of playing were amazing. I probably would not play again.
Yeah, it is interesting. And by the way, like, speaking of the age, obviously you're physically limited for a certain amount of time in sports, but I know it's like you could probably technically still do it at 40 like esports. I'm just not sure like if there would be any physical drop off, or secondly if 40-year-olds are is in tune with the games like these days. So like what's kind of the oldest age group you've seen getting it done on the esports scene, and what's like the younger side?
Yeah, so younger side is definitely like I talk about Rocket League. You can be 13. You have to be at least 13 to play in like the qualifiers for the World Championships and to get into the like groups play for the World Championships. So there, I think the youngest player was 14 that played at a world stage for Rocket League, but you have players, especially like in League of Legends, that are approaching like 30, 31, 32, which again isn't old in a scale of like a person in humanity, but is kind of where the cap is getting to of like 30, 31, 32, which is kind of the same in sports. And it's kind of the same where like a lot of players don't make it towards that point. A lot of players aren't playing that consistent for that long to make it to that point, but there are like a select few that have made it up to that age.
Oh yeah, that is crazy. And I think one of the ways that I've seen a lot of esports guys either aid their career or be riding off more into it or just being like more of a personality, I guess,
Yeah.
like a couple that come to mind is like Shroud and Ninja and stuff. And so how many guys are taking that route? And then secondly, like Is that sort of the best thing to do at getting into esports and to be maybe one of the more recognizable players?
100%. I think that that is like the second biggest thing. Like next to your play is how big of a name you are, because it's again kind of that safety net where you can, if you are that big, if you have that much people like cheering you on, and if you're still, even if you're not like playing on the world stage, if you're playing at a level that is top 1,000 in the world, like people are going to tune in, people are going to watch, people are going to want advice, and then they can also like ask advice of how you're playing on stage, how you got towards your point. So that's the big thing right now is like a lot of organizations aren't focusing on content enough, which is like a big killer. Like they're that's the big reason a lot of like orgs are going out of business is they're like, we're gonna sign all these teams for millions of dollars and we're gonna try and make our money back off of jersey sales and nothing else. And like it doesn't work out. So I think content is the big way in. And I think for like getting yourself recognized, like you could be a player that is amongst thousands of others in these top ranks. But if you have 200 people watching on your stream, all of a sudden you could have a DM instantly.
Oh yeah, it's a crazy scene. And I would say I know some of the more popular names like that have certainly, I feel like, gotten more of the attention, even if they weren't like the
Yeah.
best at the game. And it does create a lot of buzz, and so that's something to always keep in mind. But as you get into Ohio State and on the university side, by the way, like, do you know how many? Because I swear I've seen some, like, how many universities are providing that esports program now, and is that number like growing?
Yeah, it's definitely growing. There are some asterisks right now next to a lot of the esports programs where a lot of them are club programs. So it's not going to be like your sports where you have a full ride scholarship and you're playing at the highest level. I will say there are some schools that do that. And specifically like Fisher College, Maryland University have, or Marysville University have full ride scholarships to like play Rocket League or play League of Legends. But then again, they're also ones that are winning national championships and winning everything else. Ohio State has one of the club programs, so they don't have like pay you in scholarship, but they still have like teams. So I think it's growing in the sense that it's there's a lot of clubs popping up, but there aren't as many like school backed, funding backed teams as of right now.
And like on that point, has the NCAA, I'm not sure if they have talked about like sanctioning that sport and getting their whole governing body on top of it. And then secondly, like who does govern a lot of kind of the events? I mean, I'm sure again it varies, but like is there one, you know, or a few conglomerates that are sticking out, or names to know?
Yeah, so NCAA hasn't really touched it yet. It's still kind of like that Wild West. There is the biggest thing I think that was formed last year. A couple of the schools in the Big Ten Conference got together and said, we're already in the Big Ten Conference in sports. Why don't we get in a Big Ten Conference for esports since all of us have an esports club together? So the Big Ten Esports Conference was formed last year. So they're kind of doing a little bit of governing, but the big problem is like esports is unequal to sports where like you could have Division 1 Ohio State, one of the best football teams in the world, that has a club program for esports, and you could have like a Michigan State that might not be the hottest in football, but they have like a really good esports program. So it's hard to find those like delineations of like Division 1 and like putting schools in those same boxes as regular sports, which makes it harder for like administrations to see, and then it makes it harder to get funding overall. But there are a few. I think NACE is one of the big ones that's doing like collegiate focused group. Like you pay like $50 for your team to enter, and then like there's a group play and league play and stuff.
Yeah, and but are there any like regions too in the country or anywhere that have really like, and I feel like it wouldn't matter as much as like sports. Just an example, baseball in the warmer climates where you can play all the way
Yeah.
around. You seem to have more players that come right out of those regions. But on the esports side, are there any regions that have more of a bias of like the great players that are coming out of there?
Yeah, I think California area, more like LA, because they have, like I said, they have Riot Arena there. A lot of the players like go there to play. And then honestly, like some of the bigger cities, like here in Ohio, I know we have the most important thing is like the communities that have established like gaming cafes and other stuff that make it more accessible to the public just get a wider net to cast and have more people playing. So they usually have like the higher level players, but it's also like for specifically esports, there's a lot of imports. There's a lot of players coming from Europe or coming from South Africa or coming from over China, somewhere over there to come play here.
Yeah, and that's another thing I think. Just knocking down that barrier to entry is huge, but it would be interesting to see like once everyone gets all that equal access where the players come from. Especially I know like it just seems a lot of the leagues here in America have optimized things where they can get those draws from all the leagues to get the players. So it is interesting to break it down. But Luke, I mean, just getting into the last thing here, like what are your big goals moving forward and what would you ultimately like to do in the broadcasting space?
I mean, tell stories. That's always my number one goal. I hate for it to be about me. I always love for it to be about somebody else and telling stories that were never told before. I think my big goal again would be either to be on a tier one esports broadcast or be on a consistent sports broadcast where I could do esports as well on the side. And with kind of my pathway through the radio broadcast program, after you do a semester there, they let you apply and send a reel to the Big Ten network. So that would be one of my big goals is after a semester be on the Big Ten network and things like that. But just keep casting, keep enjoying it, I guess.
Well, Luke, you're a great guest. And by the way, you'll see some of his prep for like those esports events on screen throughout the pod and everything. And so it was great having you on and getting all that perspective. And I'm sure we could go on forever, but I'll just try to wrap the announcer's hour to 1 hour. So, but Luke, thank you so much for your time. For sure, I'll be in touch and try to definitely meet you at some point here in the real time if I'm ever up there in Columbus. So,
Yeah, for sure. We got to find a time to meet. We'll have some dinner or something. There's some good restaurants around here in Columbus. So if you're ever visiting, we
yeah.
definitely got to go. But I appreciate you having me, man.
Well, yeah, and enjoy your time in Ohio State in this semester to get into the sports world. But that'll do it for another episode of the Announcers Hour. Thank you, Luke.